From Washington to Warsaw, Paris to Ankara, Brussels, Berlin, Bucharest, and Belgrade. Through pandemics and political movements, cooperation and confrontation, digital divides, and defending democracy. The German Marshall Fund is at the pulse of transatlantic relations today, convening the experts and insights needed to navigate tomorrow's world.
Good afternoon, good morning to all of you that are tuning in. A warm virtual welcome. My name is Suda David Wilp, and on behalf of the German Marshall Fund of the United States, I'd like to welcome you to our 5th Transatlantic Tuesday of 2021. Today, we're going to talk about the EU's proposed regulation on artificial intelligence. We'll discuss the merits and the weaknesses of the proposed regulation with a great speaker, Frau Alexandra Geese from the European Parliament, a member of the Green Party. Before I hand over to my colleague, Sam duPont, who will moderate the discussion, just want to go over a few things with you that are listening in. One is to please send us your questions through the Q&A box. They will queue up automatically and Sam will get to them briefly. And also, I'd like to thank our Business Advisory Council for support of today's program. So with that, I'd like to hand over the floor to my colleague, Sam, who is Deputy Director of GMF's Digital Innovation and Democracy Initiative, and he's based in our Washington, D.C. office. Thank you, and have a great conversation.
Thank you very much, Suda. It's great to be here with this fine group of attendees and with Ms. Alexandra Geese, a member of European Parliament, where she has served since 2019. Alexandra is a member of the Greens and European Free Alliance in European Parliament, and she is a member of the Internal Market Committee, which is leading the Parliament's work on the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, and now on the draft regulation on artificial intelligence. So she will be an excellent person for us to hear from today about what this regulation is aiming to achieve, how it will move forward in the Parliament, and what its implications are for transatlantic relations. And I will emphasize Suda's point that I'm very eager to incorporate all of your questions into our discussion. So please do make use of the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen, and I will pull in as many questions as I'm able to in the 45 minutes that we have. So, Ms. Geese, thank you very much for being with us. Let me begin by asking a sort of general question about where Europe is headed with this draft regulation. So the Commission unveiled this draft regulation last month. It has gotten a lot of attention and sparked a lot of dialogue since. Can you maybe illustrate for our audience what this bill is seeking to accomplish, and in your opinion, what the early draft gets right, and where you will seek to improve it as it works its way through Parliament?
Yes, very happy to do that, and thank you very much for having me and being able to speak to this distinguished audience. So what the AI regulation is trying to achieve is to create a legal framework for the rollout of all the technologies that go under the term of artificial intelligence in Europe. In order to have legal certainties for companies who want to invest and develop and deploy this technology. So it starts out basically with creating 3 different categories of artificial intelligence. The first ones are those, and it doesn't regulate the technology, it regulates applications of that technology. Because what we don't want to do is to really regulate the technical part, the technology itself, but its practical application within the society. So what it does, it starts out with specifying those applications that will be banned in Europe, which are, first of all, social scoring, the Chinese style social scoring, where citizens continuously receive a score for how they behave, even if it's perfectly legal, and then might be banned from using certain services, for example, in society. This is the kind of total surveillance which we absolutely do not want in Europe, and this is made very clear in this regulation. And I think this is one of the really positive points in this proposal by the European Commission. Then there's also a ban on biometric identification in public spaces that was quite strongly requested from civil society, also in the consultation that the EU Commission itself runs. There, if I can start with a little criticism, I think the problem here is that the exceptions for the use by law enforcement are very, very large. So practically every time a child goes missing, you can activate it. And that would be a strong incentive, because it's going to be very difficult for a judge to say, no, we're switching it off, and then maybe something happens. So I think this is one of the points that will be heavily discussed, because this is one of the aspects of artificial intelligence that receives a lot of attention also from a broader public, and not only from an audience of experts. Then we have a second category, which are the high-risk applications. And here the Commission defines a range of different areas where those applications can be used. For example, education, recruitment, credit scoring, asylum, migration, access to essential public and private services, and so on. I think the areas are quite well chosen here. So I think the Commission has put a lot of thinking and a lot of effort in figuring out which areas are particularly crucial and particularly dangerous also. But then I have some other reserves here, which I will explain in a second. Then we have a third category, which is considered low risk, which comprises applications where I'm a little bit surprised that they're considered low risk. And here we have only transparency obligations, which are basically deepfakes and emotion recognition. Where I would say, well, this is basically snake oil, because there's absolutely no scientific evidence this works. And even if it did work, do we really want that as a society? This is something I think the Commission might have addressed in that framework, but it didn't. And you can figure out, this is another point of criticism I would have. But I would like to go back to the high risk areas, because what happens if an application is classified as high risk? There's a series of obligations that those who produce or employ or use this technology have to abide by. So for example, risk management, the documentation obligations, record keeping obligations, and so on, the obligations on the data. So I think from a technical point, this is well done. But then what happens? Companies have to pass a conformity assessment. In some cases, they can do that conformity assessment themselves. In other cases, it has to be approved by a notified body, which are basically private organizations specializing usually in approving technical products. And then there is some oversight by a national authority in a member state. So at a first at first sight, this looks good, because this is a procedure that has been used for a long time in Europe for technical products. There's also this CE code that can be put on the products. If you have a physical product, it's a well-known procedure in Europe. And this seems to make sense. And I think the technical obligations are quite sound. And here comes my main criticism to the whole regulation. What is absolutely not addressed are the huge ethical, societal, and fundamental rights concerns that artificial intelligence technologies raise. I mean, artificial intelligence poses so many questions to our society, to who we want to be as human beings. How do we want to live as democratic societies, that are not addressed? Because some artificial intelligence applications really challenge the idea of an individual that makes responsible decisions and is therefore held responsible for them in our society. This is the basis of our free and democratic societies. because AI takes decisions on a group of people, takes decisions on me as a single person, as being part of a group or different groups. And this is absolutely not being addressed. For example, on bias. There is a provision that says that data has to be representative, but it doesn't say representative of what. So for example, if an employer uses an AI tool to support his recruitment or her recruitment, it doesn't say whether the data needs to be representative of the whole of society as a whole, or of the people already working in that company. And who is accountable for that? The company that uses the AI tool, the one who develops it, who can't know, obviously, what representative of what it is supposed to be. And this is completely not addressed. And also, if bias is detected in such a tool, no corrective measures are foreseen. Sorry, my light here in the office. So I think, often an argument is, well, AI poses issues of bias, but it can also be used to detect bias, because as humans, we are biased. So for women, it's probably always more difficult to get a job in IT or in banking because of a traditional image we have of what a banker is supposed to look like. And some people say, well, I can solve that because it's objective, but we know from a lot of scientific evidence, it's not. It reinforces prejudice and discrimination. But rather, and the Commission knows that, so that's why they say the data needs to be representative and we have to prevent feedback loops. But it doesn't say, well, you have to make the bias transparent and then make proposals on how you want to deal with it, which is what, as a society, we should be doing, and not just accept it and go on. So this is an important point of criticism, I think. Then another point that is maybe just one more that is not addressed is the asymmetry of knowledge. Companies that produce AI have huge amounts of data about human society that they have to use to train their algorithms. And therefore, they have enormous knowledge and enormous power about, they know how the algorithms work, they know what data was used to train them, and they are able to use that tool. But the people who are probably affected negatively by those AI tools, which are the groups that are most likely to be discriminated against, like women, like people of color, people with disabilities, and so on, don't know this. They don't have the knowledge what kind of data has been used to train the algorithm. They don't know how the algorithm works. They don't know what kind of fairness measure was employed. But in order to seek legal redress, in this case, to verify the decision of a notified body, you have to show that you have a legitimate interest. So how can you show that you have a legitimate interest if you don't have access to the system? And I think this asymmetry of knowledge has not been addressed, and how society comes into deciding what kind of AI applications we want and which applications we do not want, or only with certain safeguards. This is absolutely not considered. It's like a technical product where safety has to be made sure, and it's just a task for a notified body, so a technical standard controller, basically, to deal with it. Society is completely shut out here.
Well, I think that's a very good introduction and useful to highlight a couple critiques of it. And maybe I'd be curious to drill down just a little bit more on those critiques that you highlighted related to asymmetry of knowledge and related to bias. Is the solution here, as the Parliament starts to work on this bill, is the solution is it as simple as just adding to the list of requirements that a high-risk provider of AI must meet? Or is there a more comprehensive overhaul of the approach taken by the Commission required?
I think it requires a comprehensive overhaul of the thinking behind it, of considering AI just as a technical product. I mean, it can be a technical product. The distinction I usually make is AI that is being used for machines, to manage machines, so which we can use in production, in industrial production, for example, or to manage smart electricity grids, where AI is extremely helpful. extremely important to combat climate change. And I don't think we need that much more there. I mean, the obligations are fine and even maybe too much. When AI is used to manage people, human beings, that's a different issue. And I think what we need there is to address the asymmetry of knowledge. So to bring in society, to involve people, to have a say, to get that, to achieve that, to have that knowledge, to have access to that knowledge, to have the right to know how, not only that an algorithm is there and is maybe like a chat, but there are obligations, for example, for chatbots. There has to be transparency, and I have to know that the system is being used, that I'm talking not to a human being, but to a chatbot. Or in the area of recruitment, that would mean I know that an AI system is used to choose my or not to choose my CV. But that's it. I have no further right. I don't have the right to refuse that, because that will not be possible. I'm just an object of that legislation. I'm not a subject. I'm not an actor. So I think what the Commission needs to do is to bring in civil society here. For example, to give consumers organizations or organizations of representative of certain population groups the right to seek legal redress, the right to require audits of the systems if there are doubts on them not being objective or discriminating against certain groups of people. The right, for example, in the case that bias is detected, that needs to be made public. And I think a company using that system needs to say, oh, well, we realize we have that bias, and we know we will never have data sets or algorithms that are completely free of bias. But we have to address it. So a company has to make suggestion on how they want to address it. So if you have a biased data set, you can still say, well, we want a minimum quota of women of 30%, 50% or something. But that's something that's difficult to put into legislation, because a quota of 50% not always might make sense, not in all areas. So I think we have to find a mechanism to make it more proactive and to give people the possibility to inquire, to gain access to the information they need, and to seek, to have the possibility to request audits or to seek legal redress in an easier way, because otherwise the most affected groups will be those who have less access to that information and less access to that kind of legal redress. So it's really the thinking. A second point, maybe that's important here, there are some applications where we have to ask ourselves, do we want them as society? For example, the recognition, automatic recognition of gender, which is based on very simple, very basic stereotypes, and on the assumption that only two genders exist and no trans people. So I think that's an interesting question to ask ourselves. Is that the kind of society we want, where all women have long hair and makeup and all men have short hair and no makeup? Or shouldn't we rule out those kinds of applications and decide, well, we want a diverse society and we don't want these technical systems? And as we say, in the digital sector, code is law. Once these systems are installed everywhere, they will have consequences, because people, won't, like women will not say, well, I get shut out of the ladies' toilet every time because my hair is too short, so I let it grow. So I think there we really need a discussion in society, and I think the Commission should have brought that up, that there are applications that raise societal concerns and that need to be discussed beforehand. Another one is the recognition of sexual orientation, for example, which is a problem in itself, because you only have two choices, gay or straight. We don't know whether they work or not, actually, so that might not even be scientifically sound. Mm-hmm. And we have an issue in Europe with a few countries where rule of law is not being respected anymore, and LGBTQ people have to fear persecution or at least sanctions of some kind. So do we really want those applications? That's a question that the Commission should have asked at least.
Yeah. So yeah, you've highlighted a few specific and sort of especially dystopian applications of AI that can certainly see all sorts of potential scary outcomes that result from widespread use of such applications. And I think this maybe gets to one of the sort of fundamental questions when regulating a rapidly emerging technology like this is how how much should regulators intervene, and how much should they, or how much should regulators intervene as the technology is evolving, and how much should they be sort of waiting for specific challenges to arise and then responding to those specific circumstances? And we've gotten a couple questions in the chat pushing back, particularly on the idea of bias and how you define bias. And certainly there are, in the way that you're talking about algorithms potentially being used to discriminate, clearly that is the kind of application that we want to be discouraging or prohibiting. But defining what bias is actually a sort of very tricky thing to do from a regulatory perspective. And so I guess the bigger question that I'm asking is, as you go forward with this regulatory process and looking to put guardrails on this very rapidly changing technology, how do you strike the right balance between protecting fundamental rights, putting in place well thought through and important and necessary regulations on the one hand, while on the other hand, avoiding a excessively prescriptive regulations that become obsolete very quickly because the technology is evolving, or have the effect of discouraging innovation and discouraging companies from trying new things and inventing new applications.
Oops, sorry. Yeah. Getting there, sorry, trying to unmute. Well, that is a tricky balance indeed. I think the first point is to make that distinction between AI for machines and AI for human beings. So I think industrial companies don't need to worry about excessive legislation because they usually don't use AI to manipulate or discriminate human beings. That's the first. Then the second is, as I said, what I want is not an outright ban, but I want a public debate, because currently AI is a little bit in this kind of technology niche that only experts who work with it are discussing it. But AI is a host of technologies that poses questions to society. So how can you bring civil society in? And I think one way is to give in the legislation the possibility, as I said before, to non-governmental organizations or representative of certain population groups to ask for audits, for example, to come in, to be able to seek legal redress on behalf of individuals. So that kind of thing. More meaningful transparency. The right to refuse in certain cases. I mean, the devil is really in the details, so it's very difficult to make a very general, to say something very general on this. But I think it's this kind of thing. And if we speak about hindering innovation, the question is, what is innovation? You know, because often people say, well, don't worry about it. You don't want to worry about, to spend time worrying about bias when you can have innovation. You don't want to hamper innovation. So what is innovation? I think we have plenty of scientific evidence that companies with diverse boards are more successful, more sustainable, and that societies which are more diverse, which have more diverse leadership, are offer more well-being to their citizens. We have seen that during COVID, for example, and I mean, there is plenty of evidence on that. So I don't think being innovative means restricting leadership to males, to white people, which is what is currently happening with AI. This is what evidence is showing, that many people will be cut out by AI technology, especially in recruitment, but also in credit scoring. I mean, there's this famous Apple case of a couple who owns the same company, has the same number of kids, the same cars, the same house, and so on, was a famous case. And the credit accorded, given to the husband was 20 times higher than the one given to the wife. And this happens all the time in credit scoring, for example, very similar in recruitment. And I don't think this is really innovative. We don't want to go back to the 19th century. We want to go forward. So the question is, how well can we support AI to overcome those bias issues and to really benefit the whole of society? Because what we are seeing right now is that AI is a technology, as it is used now, that entails a concentration of wealth and of power. And this is, I think, what we need to challenge. And this is what we can use legislation for.
Sure. So if I can pivot a little bit at this point in the conversation, I'd love to discuss a little bit the international implications of this, the draft law and the vision that you've articulated for how it might be shaped going forward. And I guess to begin at home in Europe, there have been studies put out recently looking at an international race in AI and how different jurisdictions are faring in this theoretical competition. And the United States appears to continue to have a lead when looking at R&D dollars put into AI, looking at patents, looking at adoption of the kinds of computers that are needed for AI to run, with China closing that gap. And the European Union lagging behind. Certainly don't disagree with your contention that more diverse companies are often more successful. But I think the question still stands as to whether more prescriptive and detailed regulations on even if it's just a narrow set of AI applications could end up having deleterious effects on European efforts to compete and to catch up with the United States and with China on this. So the big question is, do you see the idea of such a race in AI as valid, or is that something that is either made up or entirely secondary to the sort of more fundamental rights questions that you're primarily focused on? And I guess we can go from there. But that's maybe a big question to start with.
That is a big question, yeah. And there are very many different facets to that. I mean, the first question is, if it's a race, where do we want to go? And this is something that I usually answer when the comparison is with China, because I think where China is going, we don't want to go, neither the US nor Europe, definitely. So I think we need to figure out what kind of innovation we want, and therefore what kind of AI we want. That is crucial. I agree on Europe lagging behind the United States. That has to do with our financial markets. We don't have all that private equity. That has to do with the lack of public investment in research 20 years ago, because I mean, the internet was not an invention of Google alone or Facebook, or just to name a few of the handful of companies, but there was a lot of US public investments, just DARPA and so on. So I think this is something where Europe is actually lagging behind, and understanding that at this point of time where we don't have that kind of private equity, we would need a lot more public investment. And this is on the European member states, definitely, and I'm totally advocating this. Not to close, not for a strategic autonomy in a sense of closing the US off or shutting ourselves down. This is really not the idea, but of having the technology ourselves in order to do what we want with it. That's important. But I think on an international level, the US and Europe should cooperate very closely, because here we are really on the same side as free and democratic societies. Then having a legal framework I don't think it hampers competition on the European side, because we are a lot stronger on industrial production rather than on consumer services. So I think our companies, many of our companies, not all of them obviously, but many of our companies have a different interest, and they need a certain legal framework. While the very huge corporations from Silicon Valley basically can afford not to have legal certainty, that's more the American style. Then you risk litigation and you consider how much the risk is. I think this is something that European companies don't want to risk. So as long as they don't have legal certainty, they prefer to stay out. And then to touch a sensitive subject on the European side, we obviously have an issue in Europe to do some, self-criticism with GDPR compliance. So we're all very proud of GDPR, and rightly so, and it's setting a global standard, but we enforce it very well against our smaller, medium-sized, and even large European companies on a national level. But it's not being well enforced, unfortunately, in Ireland, where the huge corporations are headquartered. And I think that gives US companies, it's not because they're American, but it's a fact that they're big and they're difficult. We have competition issues on the markets right now. They have a competitive advantage because they can use all the data that our companies don't have, because they can't risk this gray area in terms of GDPR compliance, because against them, GDPR is being enforced on a national level, and the Irish authority in this moment is not enforcing it. So maybe that's going to change in a couple of years. I mean, there's a lot going on, the competition and antitrust sector, and there the positive movement really comes from the US. I think we will have to discuss that as well. How do markets work in AI? How many companies can be important players there? What about the control of data and so on? But that's maybe a different issue.
Yeah, well, I think you would certainly have a lot of heads nodding in Washington with your earlier statement that there's a need for US-EU cooperation on AI, because at the end of the day, our fundamental values are aligned. And I think in Washington, as throughout Europe, folks are looking at the kinds of applications of AI that are being put in place in China, and the kinds of the vision for regulation of technology in general and AI specifically that's been articulated in China as deeply problematic, and there is a need to counteract that. At the same time, I think it's increasingly well understood that China has certain structural advantages in this technology. There's virtually limitless access to citizen data without meaningful privacy laws in place in China, and the legal regimes that exist in Europe and the United States put appropriate restrictions in place on both corporate and government access to data. So there is, in some sense, a need for that kind of cooperation. I guess, in addition to cooperating in sort of developing the technology, I wonder if there is also room for US-EU cooperation on these kinds of regulations. And if so, how, as this moves forward, you would expect the US government, US companies, maybe even US civil society to have opportunities to provide input into the process, both with a view to ensuring that any regulations that come out of the process don't create new barriers to US-EU cooperation and trade, and also potentially for to start to hone a model that could have some applications in the United States as well.
Well, I think the first proposal was well received in Washington. From what I heard, the reaction was quite positive, and it wasn't absolutely perceived as anything protectionist or against the US from what I'm hearing. And we are very positively surprised about a lot of advances by the Biden administration, also in other areas. In digital, I think it's still a little bit unclear where it's going, but in terms of taxes, at least my party was quite happy to hear Joe Biden's proposals. Coming back to the Paris Accord, it was very, very positive, very welcome. So I'm really very much looking forward to working with the US on this. I think well, I'm sure the U.S. administration has its way to make its voice heard in Brussels directly with the Commission. This is something I'm quite convinced of, and I mean that's positive. We need to cooperate on this, even if then we will take the last decision as exactly as the U.S. Would do as well. But I think there's a very lively discussion going on, and I think there's also a debate and a conversation going on among lawmakers. I mean, I am exchange with congressmen, for example, with American lawmakers. American universities just joined a Stanford seminar a couple of weeks ago. Very, very interesting. So I think we are cooperating very, very closely also with the US researchers, and their input is extremely helpful and extremely important. And I think what everybody from the US is telling me, that they find it extremely interesting what is going on in Europe. And they are really looking at our regulation with great interest and great curiosity. And at least to me, they're providing very, very helpful input. For example, I'm working on the audits, not in this case, not in artificial intelligence, but in the Digital Services Act. That's another regulation that is as important probably for US European relations, and they're providing me with very precious and valuable input from experience in the US. So I think there is really a dialogue going on. What would be very, very important is to have a close cooperation in international, for example, standardization mechanisms in the UN, the OECD, and so on. I mean, this is ongoing, but I think I'm very optimistic that we will be able to improve it in the next month, when the new administration is really settled in and so on and has a clear line. I'm really looking forward to this, very optimistic in this moment. I mean, there are points where we don't agree, that is very clear. But as you pointed out, compared to China, we're on the same side, so we need to get along. That's important.
Yeah, the draft law certainly was well received in Washington. It received a favorable tweet from National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, which is a rare occurrence that a very senior official will be tweeting out approval of another country's draft laws, but certainly a good sign for cooperation going forward. And I agree with your point that greater cooperation in the standardization context will be useful as well, particularly if this draft regulation moves forward, essentially treating AI as a sort of regulatory and a standardization problem, rather, ensuring the availability of conformity assessment mechanisms that can be sort of transferable across borders, I think will be helpful in ensuring that the US providers of this technology can operate in Europe and vice versa. I again want to ask folks to plug questions into the Q&A. I'm pulling them out as I can, but maybe to ask you one more question about the China issue here. I guess my question is beyond this regulatory measure, and you've also mentioned the need for more public spending in Europe to advance this technology. Are there other measures that the Parliament or the European Union in general should be considering to advance European Union's position in the global sort of race on AI and be increasingly competitive? Or do you think this draft regulation plus additional government spending is what is necessary?
Well, the regulation is necessary, but it's absolutely not sufficient. So what we need, I think, is an investment strategy. It's a common strategy, and the Commission has come up with it. I mean, it's something we're working on. In order to coordinate research, for example, it doesn't make sense in Europe to have 4 research centers in every European member state, and the bigger ones maybe even 10, because, like, for example, in my country, in Germany, we have the Bundesländer, so like the federal states, and every one of them wants an AI research center. And on a European level, obviously, it makes a lot more sense to have 2 or 3 of them that are really, top notch and excellency, rather than having 50 over the whole territory. We need a common approach, and the Council is working on this as well, for example, on basic technological, well, the basis like semiconductors, for example, quantum computing, and so on, in order not to miss the next big step. That's all very welcome, and I think it's ongoing. It's not sufficient, because if you look at the sheer scale of investment taking place in Europe, in the US, and in China, that's where we are lagging behind. And that's where we really need to step our game, absolutely. And that's really not on the EU Commission, because the EU Commission can't decide the European budget. It had proposed a higher budget line for the digital programs we are running here in Europe. That's really on the governments of the national member states. And I think especially the bigger countries like Germany and France, for example, now that the UK unfortunately have left. This would really be on my country, among others, to spend more on research, and especially on getting the results of research also into the markets. This is often where we have a problem. It's not fundamental research, but more applied research, and then turning that research, the results of that research, into marketable products. And also financial markets, I think there we are really lagging behind, because we do have a lot of startups, but then we have trouble funding the scale-ups. And we have a lot of talent, a lot of qualified people who at a certain point leave for the US. And we would be very happy to keep them. We're very happy to exchange, and obviously really don't want to close down Europe, absolutely not. But I think we really need more funding.
Yeah.
And maybe a different kind of funding, because often people in Europe then say, oh, we also need the unicorns, or we don't have the unicorns. Maybe something interesting is more to focus on the assets we have in Europe, which are basically the network, the industrial districts, the ability to co-work, like research institutions with company, to build these big networks. You know, like the cities, we don't have this one or two big cities in Europe. We have dozens of absolutely beautiful and important cities. And I think the same thing we should do in industry and research. And this is already being done by the European Commission, but I think we could focus on this more and put some more funding on these projects. That would definitely help.
Great. Well, let me pull a question from the Q&A. We have a question particularly about the use of AI by police and law enforcement. And I think this goes partly to the proposed restrictions that this draft regulation would put in place on law enforcement's use of certain kinds of AI technology. But the question is also asking about how law enforcement will develop the ability to really use this technology and take advantage of it. The questioner writes, what are the means we will give to law enforcement to fight the risks related to AI? Law enforcement are barely equipped to catch classic thieves. How can we equip and train them to oversee AI use and diffusion?
Well, that's an interesting question. As you probably heard from my introductory words, I'm quite skeptical about the rollout, especially not of AI in general, but of recognition, biometric recognition in public spaces, which is one of the main applications. I think we just shouldn't use it. Frankly, I think the cost in terms of limiting, it's really effective when you use it once, upon a time, it's not really effective. Then classical field work in the police is more effective. In order for it to be effective, like in China, it is effective, I suppose, you have to install total surveillance of a society. But do we really want that? And a few cities have already said they don't. I think Seattle as well, or California as a whole. I think it's some very important examples from the US as well. Really, I think it's San Francisco, the Bay Area.
Yeah, certain states have ruled out use of facial recognition technology by police.
Exactly. The other interesting application, all the AI application in law enforcement and administration of justice are very, very controversial, because the data sets usually include traditional bias against certain population groups, and the feedback loops are really terrible. and even software that has been developed, for example, in the US with good intentions, for example, identifying young people who could be future victims of crime, are then used by the police in order to to survey these people or to address them as if they were already offenders. And that's extremely problematic. I mean, this is really an experience we have from the US. On the more technical part on how we can teach police to use this and enable them to use these instruments, I'm not an expert on this, I have to say. I think what is important is to bring in experts, sociologists, gender experts, experts on racism, who explain that the results, how the results of the technologies have to be used. So with a very critical eye on understanding where the bias comes from. And I think that is not easy, actually. That is not easy.
Thank you very much. I think that's a great answer to the question. We are unfortunately out of time. I think we could easily go on for another 45 minutes, but I will stop us here and thank Ms. Geese for joining us. This has been a very interesting conversation for me. I hope everyone out in the audience has enjoyed it as well. And on behalf of GMF Digital, my program, and on behalf of GMF as a whole, thank you all, and we'll hope to see you next Tuesday for our next installment of Transatlantic Tuesdays. So thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you all very much.